Ownership is what gives people independence, and it gives families the protection to control their own destinies because they're not beholden to either a big corporation or to the government.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome everyone to Reluctant Preppers. We have a special guest today, Dale Ahlquist, president of the American Chesterton Society, widely recognized expert on GK Chesterton, author of 3 books about GK Chesterton, founder of the Chesterton Academy. Dale, thank you for being here with us.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, there's 2 camps of folks that we've met, those who have heard of GK Chesterton and those who haven't. Can you tell us who was the man, GK Chesterton? How has he proven relevant to our lives? And if we ignore him, why do we do so at our own peril?
Yeah, Chesterton was, during his lifetime, one of the most famous and well-known writers in the world, and that was the early 20th century. And he died in 1936, so we're talking about his writing career, the first 1/3 of the 20th century, and it was a time of great upheaval in Western civilization, a major world war, a major worldwide depression, and then the rise of Nazi Germany to boot. And Chesterton was very prophetic in seeing all these things coming. And he was a writer who was very much against all the modern trends that were beginning at that time and have continued to our time. And so there's something about reading G.K. Chesterton now, 100 years after he actually wrote, that is as fresh and timely as ever. And I think the reason why there's a revival of interest in his writings is because he really does understand the 2 keys to the downfall of Western civilization. One is the attack on the Christian faith, and the other is the attack on the family.
So in his writings, he advanced and proposed a style of economics that most people have never heard of, distributism. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and how it strikingly differs from either capitalism or socialism?
Sure. Yeah. You know, what's interesting about both capitalism and socialism is that they're very late coming in the drama of history. Socialism arising in the 19th century as a reaction against capitalism, which really arose just shortly before that, and reached its height in the 19th century. So these are 2 new players in the ball game. Distributism represents a more traditional view of how to run a very fair and just, stable society, because capitalism is based on the individual interests, individual rights, and individual wants and needs, so that it was actually originally called individualism. A lot of people don't even know that. And that's why the reaction against it is known as socialism, which is the opposite of individualism. For socialism, the ideal is the community, and the community interests are the most important and the first that are focused on. Where distributism differs from both of them is that it recognizes that the family is the basic unit of society, and it promotes the rights and the interests of the family as opposed to those of the individual or those of the community. That individual rights and community rights come second to the family's needs and the family's interests.
So the name will cause suspicion in a lot of people. When they hear distributism, it sounds like a blackjack dealer distributing out all the goodies to all the people. It sounds like this form of collectivism where they're distributing the wealth, but that's not at all what it's about, is it?
No, and you're absolutely right when you say the name itself has created great confusion and misunderstanding. And the folks who first put forth this idea in the early 20th century, G.K. Chesterton and his colleague Hilaire Belloc, they both agreed that it was a rotten name, and they never came up with a better one. and those who have really been proponents of the idea since then have all agreed we need to come up with a better name, and they haven't come up with a better one. The idea, the word itself, comes from an encyclical of Pope Leo XIII called Rerum Novarum that was written in 18 1791. That's where he was addressing great social injustices that had arisen really out of industrial capitalism. And the Pope saw that there were the false reaction, the false solution to the societal ills that were created by really widespread misery of people clustering to the cities and just huge unemployment as people, lost all their means of production, lost their ownership. He saw that the wrong reaction was socialism. And so it was a warning against socialism and somehow trying to protect the rights of the workers. And he says the solution for the workers is for as many of them as possible to become owners. And he says because justice is distributive. That's where the word justice is something that everyone is entitled to. And so that's the word. That's where the word distributive was used. And so that became the byword of the distributists, because justice is something that everyone should have.
So is that a key facet of distributism, is that the individual family owns the means of their own livelihood?
Yeah, that's the whole thing. It's widespread ownership as opposed to under capitalism. I think Chesterton's great criticism of capitalism is not that there are too many capitalists, but there are too few. There are too few people who have capital, and they have an inordinate amount of capital, and everyone else, the great majority of the population, are wage earners working for those few who have the capital. When you have a society that is largely composed of wage earners, they don't have really autonomy in their lives, and they don't really have enough to have a control of their families and their own family's destiny. They're not autonomous. Chesterton says that the opposite to employment is not unemployment. The opposite to employment is independence. And so it's ownership is what gives people independence, and it gives families the protection to control their own destinies, because they're not beholden to either a big corporation or to the government.
Yeah, so the socialism would be to the government as well. I mean, the collectivist society, people have a specter of what that looks like, that basically you work and all of the fruits of your labor go to the state, and it distributes it out as it sees fit to most everybody, and it's very disincentivizing. It not aligned with natural motivation that people have to better their situation, protect their families. So what does distributism do that's different from that? What does distributism actually look like in an ordinary person's life?
What it looks like is as many small businesses as possible that are owned by families. And one of the reasons why our society has come apart, according to GK Chesterton, started when so many people became wage earners, and when women started leaving the home to work, it took them away from their families. But before that, men had been taken away from their families by having to be wage earners. And in the modern capitalist society, you have both parents working for someone else, and no one's really taking care of their family, and families are falling apart as a result. So the distributist ideal is people not working for someone else, but working for themselves, both husband and wife and children, really running their own family business. And, the ideal would be the family farm, but it doesn't have to be farming. It can be other trades, other means of people really in charge of their own income without having to live on a wage.
So that sounds like entrepreneurism.
Oh, very much. And, that's where, in most ways, distributism aligns more with capitalism than it does with socialism, but it doesn't align perfectly with either one. That's why it's its own thing. It's entrepreneurial in that it's people coming up with new ways to make money for themselves, but their focus is not on making money. Their focus really is on taking care of their family and living out just a normal life, desiring normal things, normal marriage, normal ownership, normal worship, and a normal appreciation of life itself.
When you talk about these small family businesses, the first thing that comes to mind is people shaking their heads and saying, you're wanting a throwback to the old days. We've evolved beyond that, because that's low efficiency. We've now learned about economies of scale. There's no way that a small-time, hardware store can compete with the big, huge mega chains, or any other small-time grocery store or farmer's market is going to compete with the big chains that have their lean supply chain, their just-in-time inventory, and these huge low-cost methods. So Can you speak just a bit to that, about people saying this is the old way, we've tried it, we've been there, done that, now we've moved on to bigger and better things that are going to give us a better standard of living? Because isn't there a hidden cost that's not counted when you're only looking at the price tag on things?
Oh, absolutely. And the better standard of living that everyone's talking about, none of them have paid for because they bought it with credit that they that they don't really own any of this better standard of living that they've been talking about. Yeah, they have more toys, but they haven't paid for them because they bought them on credit, and we're just in the process of collapsing under really a huge mountain of debt created by truly a capitalist system that all it does is continue to leverage money that is not even real. The money itself is not real, and it's a system that's destined for collapse. Yeah, people will say you're trying to get it back to the old way. The argument is that the old way actually was more stable. Families were more stable. The society itself was more stable. And we don't live in a stable society right now. We live in a very, very unstable society, and families are falling apart, and people really can't meet their basic needs, and yet they're driven by a consumer mentality where they want new toys and new gadgets and new thrills, but they've forgotten some really basic needs that provide much greater and deeper and long-lasting fulfillment. What's interesting, too, is in people's own buying behavior, we're starting to see a turn back to the small shop. People realize that the big box retailer, even though they could save 38 cents on toilet paper, what they never get is any service anymore. They don't get any attention when they're trying to buy something. And there's a lot of frustration. And plus, even the choices of what they used to be able to buy are fewer now, because they have to go to what I and my family affectionately refer to as the Grand Soviet Distribution Center to get the 2 or 3 things in the big box retailer that the big box retailer has said, well, these sell the best, so that's all we're going to sell.
So even from a pure economics cost standpoint, it sounds like there's hidden costs if you go only for the low cash register receipt at the end of the shopping and you judge it only by that. You say, well, definitely I should shop at the big box stores and sponsor these huge chain businesses. But as you mentioned, if that's contributing to the breakdown of families instead of supporting family businesses in the small scale, that leads to a whole host of ripple effects in the society that have their own costs that are never rolled back into that. You never see, you know, when you talk about high unemployment among the youth, or when you start talking about inner city crime, where you have poverty and unemployment contributing to violence and crime and that sort of thing. And then you have more juvenile delinquent programs and prisons and all that sort of thing. They never roll that into your cash register receipt. You know, in industry where I work, high tech industry, they talk about the levelized cost of poor quality, and basically rolling the cost of poor quality and the errors and all the things that go wrong back into the cost of the thing that you made, so that it's visible and you can drive it down. But here it seems like as a society and as a culture, we just act as though that's a mess left for somebody else to clean up. It's a separate, completely disconnected societal problem. But GK Chesterton didn't seem to see things in a disconnected sense, did he?
Oh, yeah. It's a very good way of putting it, because it's that whole disconnectedness. When we go to the big box retailer, we don't know the minimum wage earner who's pressing the buttons at the cash register. There's really no neighborly interaction anymore in the market transaction. When it was your neighbor who owned the shop, your neighbor knew about you, you knew about your neighbor, and there was an accountability that he had for what he was selling you, and he took a legitimate interest in your life when he was selling you something, and your dollar supported him. Now, when you pay money to the big box retailer, that money just flies out of the community. It doesn't stay local anymore. All of the arguments against big government, where you have a remote government that is not accountable to the local citizen, those same arguments apply to commerce as well. If commerce is local, then the local retailer, the local salesman, the local merchant is accountable to his neighbor, but also his neighbor is actually supporting the local merchant. There's a stronger bond and a stronger local strength that is developed when you have small businesses.
And some of that strength of community and of friends helping each other, neighbors helping each other, some of our folks who are interested in preparedness and making sure that they've done the due diligence to have a resilient livelihood plan for their family, they're concerned that if things turn south for one reason or another in the broader economy, that they want to have a network of close friends who know how to produce food, who know how to repair things, who know how to do the important services that are needed to get through day-to-day life. And that if we are entirely dependent upon these big box retailers and the cheapest method of getting these goods and services, when that system shows fragile cracks or whatever, when that system breaks down, that leaves us much more vulnerable than having a resilient network of friends who have actual useful skills. When we know where our food comes from, and we can eat local and eat healthy, or get our services provided locally.
Yeah, and a corollary to that is how modern technology has made us more isolated from one another. We have the best forms of communication in the world, says Chesterton, right when we don't know what to say to each other. And but he said he also has he says, we can now talk to across the ocean by wireless, but we don't talk to our next door neighbor anymore.
Right, and that says so many communities, like the suburban neighborhood that we found. It takes extraordinary effort, because those structures that would naturally connect you with your neighbors anymore are the things that people avoid for these, in the name of efficiency, or in the name of lower cost, or in the name of trying to get that cheaper, higher standard of living.
Yeah, Chesterton points out too that efficiency is not a goal, and we have made efficiency a goal, and it is not. It is a secondary thing. And our problem is that we've elevated secondary things into a primary place in our lives.
Two little anecdotes that come to mind, and they may trigger additional reflections from you on this, is our local hardware store, locally owned and operated hardware store, small time in our neighborhood. The manager there was lamenting to me that he had a very difficult to please customer who came in and said, "I want you to sell me this lawnmower. I can get the same brand from the big box store in town for less than you're selling it to me. Can you match their price?" He said, I'm sorry, I can't match their price. They deal in volumes that I never can, and so they get deals I don't get. But I'll treat you fairly. I'll take care of you. I'll provide you good service. The guy said, that's just a bunch of talk. I'm going to go get my lower price. He disappeared. A few weeks later, the man was back to get a new blade for that mower. And he picked out a blade off the shelf of the hardware store, brought it to the cash register, and started patting his pockets and saying, "Oh, I've left my wallet at home. Can I just take this with me? I'm really in a hurry to get this job done, and I'll pay you back when I'm back here tomorrow." And the hardware store owner looked at him slowly and said, "I can do that. Try getting away with that down at the big box store down the street." And that's an example of what you were talking about earlier, of the kind of relationships and synergies that we can form when we do rely on each other in relationships.
Yeah, very good point. And when you complain at the big box retailer, who are you complaining to? Just a wage earner who doesn't really care about what you have to say and can't do anything about it anyway to help you. So you take out your wrath on someone who is as much a victim of the problem as you are.
Another fruit of distributism or distributed ownership is, if you're dealing with the owner, you're dealing with someone whose motivations are inherently aligned with the vital success of the business, and that means really caring about what every customer thinks.
That's right.
Satisfying them. When you talked about the large merchants of vacuum or sucking away the money back to the corporate headquarters, and it's not staying in the community, reminded me of when we would go on vacation on a cruise ship, and we'd visit island after island after island around different countries around the Caribbean, and see the same chain restaurants, the same chain jewelry stores, the same chain merchants there, and realizing that the money that's spent there does not stay there. You see the people around in those communities in desperate poverty, but they have these luxury, selling high priced, catering to the wealthy travelers, these stores, but the money is not staying there. It's just disappearing. And that was a couple decades ago, and I thought, oh, this is so unfair and so sad and so wrong. They've got to get even the resorts. A lot of these big name, you can imagine all those hotels that you can rattle off the names of. They all have their big blockbuster resorts in these beautiful but poor places, and you realize the money from the people who spend in those resorts is also not staying there. It's leaving as well. And if they only had locally owned resorts, then the money could stay right there, and they could actually build up their standard of living and become owners, not just minimum wage earners there.
And that's a perfect example. And of course, it's happening on a different scale, but all around the United States. Because I travel all around the United States, and I don't know what city I'm in because I'm looking at the same retailers everywhere.
Exactly. That's where I was going to go next. Yep. Same thing. Is it now we see it here? Yep. I saw it there when I was in these desperately poor places. Mm-hmm. I thought, wow, that's really stark to see that here. And it's dawned on me slowly here 2 decades later that I'm seeing it all the time, and I've just stopped noticing it.
Yeah.
It's all around us now.
And it's really a very discouraging phenomenon, because again, that money is not staying in the community, and it's all being run by a bunch of wage earners who have no stake in what they're doing. And there's a general dissatisfaction that comes from that, too. That someone who's just a wage earner, first of all, is not going to be making enough money to really take care of their own needs. And secondly, they're going to have an inherent dissatisfaction with what they're doing.
So what can an ordinary average person do to take a first few steps towards turning away from being one of these wage slaves for this nameless, faceless, large corporation, and instead start taking care of their family in ways that's more resilient?
Well, there's two small steps, and it has to start with small steps. And I think Chesterton is very, very wise in his advice on this. He says it starts with a tendency against a tendency. And anything we do to reverse the trend, reverse the tendency, is a good step. So we actually have to start by not patronizing the big chain stores whenever possible, to try to patronize local commerce as much as possible. And sometimes that means a self-tax is what it is.
Yeah, because the first thing I can think of is the large families or families who are living on a tight budget, and these days are certainly hard on families that are going to think, you've got to be kidding me. I'm going to right away spend 25% more if I don't go to the cheapest store that I know of.
But in the long run, it'll be better. That's the problem. It means putting off some immediate gratification. And it's true. But then, of course, the other thing is, if we work for a big corporation, trying to make that big corporation put its dollars into the local economy in any way we can. It's interesting. These big corporations have become sort of quasi governments where there are employee activists within them. That's why you have major corporations who are promoting homosexual rights, for instance, because there's a few activist employees that start pushing these things. Well, you could become that activist employee and start getting that company to start doing more things locally and taking better care of the community in which it lives. And that's one thing. But then ultimately, to try to be your own business, to find ways to break out of the wage mentality. And that means making a plan and working for it, figuring out what trade you can do and do on your own where you don't have to work for someone else.
So 3 steps I heard: buy local when you can, convince your employer, advocate with your employer to buy local goods and services when they can, and third, find ways to create new streams of income for your own family by becoming your own boss starting a business.
Those are the tendencies against a tendency.
Excellent. Any final thoughts, Dale, before we let you go, on how distributism is more family-friendly than either capitalism or socialism?
Well, there's the general criticism of distributism comes from capitalists because they say, well, you are trying to somehow squelch entrepreneurism and squelch a free market economy. And no, distributism absolutely promotes entrepreneurship, and it is truly a free market economy where there's a fairness in the market, and it's not completely run by the giants and by the big boys. And I think there's a normal tendency among conservatives to think that any criticism of capitalism is an endorsement of socialism. And we have to get away from that mentality. We have to understand that the criticism of capitalism are quite legitimate and serious because, as Chesterton points out, he says there are two major relationships in our society that are under attack. One is the relationship between a man and a woman in marriage, and the other is the relationship between a mother and child. Those two relationships, he says, are under attack. And he says it is our capitalist society that has attacked them. And that is an eye-opener, a big surprise to say that it was capitalism, is because of the wage mentality that has pulled people out of their homes, that has destroyed the home life. The false solution, as Chesterton again says, is socialism, because something has to run in and rush in and fill the void left by the family. That's going to be the state. The state will replace the family.
Well, that's sobering words. And I know that people have lived that, and some of us will be waking up from sleepwalking in that for being in the second generation of this big trend, or more beyond the second generation, if Chesterton was writing about this a century ago.
There's a couple of resources for people who want to read more about this and find out more about it. There is the Distributist website called the Distributisreview.com, and then there is the book that the American Chesterton Society published called The Hound of Distributism, which you can get at chesterton.org. And then in one of my books on Chesterton called The Complete Thinker, I have a chapter in there called Buying and Selling, and I guess I'd urge everybody to read that chapter in the book, The Complete Thinker, about GK Chesterton.
It sounds like when people find out about the alternative to either unbridled capitalism or socialism, that being distributism, that's truly the most family-friendly of the three, they'll be able to make some choices that start pretty simple choices close to home, and end up being able to build a more resilient, reliable source of income that really supports the relationships and the health of their family, and therefore, since the family is the building block of society, of our greater good. Any parting thoughts for our viewers before we let you go, Dale?
Read G.K. Chesterton. That's always the parting thought.
Thank you very much. That was Dale Ahlquist, president of the American Chesterton Society. Dale, thank you for all of your time.
God bless. Thank you very much.
You too.